Welcome to our deep dive into the fascinating world of aircraft performance.
Yeah.
We've got some excerpts from a pilot training manual here,
Yep.
and you're interested in understanding, what makes a plane fly, how far it can go, and what its limits are.
Yeah.
So we're going to break down these, complex concepts into something you can really grasp.
Absolutely.
And
What's really key here is that we're not just talking about numbers and formulas.
yeah,
We're going to explore the why behind those numbers,
yeah.
the forces at play that determine how an airplane behaves in the air.
Yeah, you've probably heard the saying, it's not rocket science.
Right.
Well, in this case, it kind of is.
Yeah.
But don't worry, we'll keep it grounded and relatable.
Absolutely.
Let's start with the atmosphere.
Okay.
Minutes all around us, but it's easy to forget how much it impacts flying.
Think of it this way. The atmosphere is like a giant ocean of air,
Okay.
and an airplane has to navigate through it just like a ship navigates through water. The density of that air is constantly changing with altitude and temperature.
Sure.
And those changes have a massive impact on aircraft performance.
Okay, so let's unpack this density thing. I remember from my high school science class that air pressure is the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on us.
Yeah,
And standard sea level pressure is about 14.7 pounds per square inch, or 29.92 inches of mercury.
that's right. And as you climb higher, there's less air above you, so the pressure decreases.
Right.
What gets interesting is how this lower pressure affects the air density. It gets thinner.
Hmm.
Thinner air means less force on the wings, making it harder for the plane to generate lift.
So how do pilots account for these constantly changing conditions?
Yeah.
I mean, do they have to recalculate everything all the time?
Well, that's where the concept of the standard atmosphere comes in.
Okay.
It provides a baseline for comparing aircraft performance, regardless of the actual weather on any given day.
Right.
Think of it like a universal reference point.
I see. So it's like a standardized measuring stick.
Right.
Does the standard atmosphere assume specific temperature and pressure changes as you go higher?
Exactly. It assumes a specific lapse rate,
Okay.
meaning how much the temperature and pressure decrease per 1,000 feet of altitude.
Right.
So the standard atmosphere assumes a temperature drop of about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit and a pressure decrease of about 1 inch of mercury for every 1,000 feet you climb,
Okay.
at least up to 10,000 feet.
But what happens when conditions aren't standard?
Right.
Say you're taking off on a scorching hot day or in the mountains where the air is naturally thinner.
Yeah.
How does that affect things?
That's where we get into density altitude.
Okay.
It's essentially pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature.
Got it.
Tells you how the air density at your location compares to the standard atmosphere.
So density altitude gives you a more accurate picture of how the plane will actually perform,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Because it considers the actual air density, not just the altitude according to your altimeter.
Imagine you're at an airport at 5,000 feet elevation on a sweltering summer day.
Okay.
The air might be so thin that your plane performs as if it were at 7,000 feet in the standard atmosphere.
Oh, wow.
That's high density altitude, and it can significantly reduce your aircraft's performance.
Okay, now that's a bit unsettling.
Sure.
High density altitude means less power and basically makes everything harder for the plane. It's like trying to run a marathon in thick mud.
Right. It's a crucial concept for pilots to understand because it directly impacts takeoff and landing distances, climb rates, and even your aircraft's stall speed.
Wow, so density altitude is like a hidden performance thief.
Absolutely.
And just to make things even more challenging, I remember reading that humidity can also affect air density.
Absolutely. Humidity, or the amount of moisture in the air, further decreases air density, adding yet another layer of complexity to aircraft performance calculations.
So we've talked about the atmosphere and density altitude.
Right.
But what about the forces that actually allow a plane to fly in the first place?
That's where we delve into the 4 fundamental forces of flight, lift, weight, thrust, and drag. I think these forces are constantly interacting, and their balance determines whether an aircraft climbs, descends, speeds up, or slows down.
Okay, so let's break these forces down one by one. We all know what weight is.
Right.
It's the force of gravity pulling the aircraft towards the Earth.
Exactly.
And lift is the force that opposes weight, keeping the plane airborne.
Yeah.
How is lift actually generated?
Lift is primarily generated by the shape and angle of the wings as they move through the air.
Okay,
The curved upper surface of the wing forces the air to flow faster over the top,
right,
creating a lower pressure area compared to the underside of the wing.
right.
This pressure difference creates an upward force lift.
So it's like the wing is constantly sucking itself upwards?
Not exactly sucking, but you've got the basic idea.
Okay.
It's all about pressure differentials and how airflow interacts with the wing's shape.
So what about thrust?
Yeah.
That's the force that propels the aircraft forward, right?
Yes, thrust is produced by the engines and counteracts drag, which is the force that resists the aircraft's movement through the air.
Now, drag seems like the bad guy in this story, always trying to slow the plane down.
Well, drag is inevitable.
Yeah.
But understanding its different forms can help us minimize its effects.
Okay.
There are two main types of drag: parasite drag and induced drag.
Okay, so parasite drag is kind of like the friction caused by the aircraft's surface as it moves through the air, right?
Exactly.
The smoother the surface, the less parasite drag.
Parasite drag increases with speed.
Okay.
So streamlining the aircraft's shape and reducing surface roughness are crucial for minimizing drag and improving fuel efficiency.
Okay, so what about induced drag?
Yeah.
Does that have something to do with the wings?
You're on the right track.
Yeah.
Induced drag is a byproduct of lift. As the wings generate lift, they also create vortices, or swirling air at their tips.
Okay.
These vortices create a slight downward force that contributes to drag.
So it's like you can't have lift without also having some induced drag.
Precisely. Induced drag actually decreases with speed.
Okay.
So finding the optimal speed for a particular flight phase is all about striking a balance between lift and drag.
Right.
We'll talk more about that when we get into range and endurance later on.
This is fascinating.
Yeah.
So you're telling me that the faster you go, the less induced drag you have?
Right.
But the more parasite drag you have.
Exactly.
It's like a constant balancing act.
Finding that sweet spot where both types of drag are minimized is key for optimizing fuel efficiency and overall performance.
So we've got these four forces interacting, and they determine how the plane moves through the air.
Yeah.
But let's talk about climbing. How does an airplane actually gain altitude?
That's where we dive into the concepts of kinetic energy and potential energy.
Okay.
Kinetic energy is the energy of motion, while potential energy is the energy of position.
Right.
A climbing aircraft essentially converts its kinetic energy, its forward speed, into potential energy, its altitude.
So it's like the plane is trading speed for height?
That's a good way to put it.
Oh.
And there are two main ways an aircraft can climb: using excess power from the engines,
Okay.
or converting airspeed into altitude, which is known as a zoom climb.
Okay, so excess power is like having extra oomph from the engines to push the plane upwards.
Right.
And a zoom climb is more like trading speed for altitude, like a kid on a swing pumping their legs to go higher.
Precisely.
Right.
But it's not just about how an aircraft climbs,
Yeah.
but also how steeply and how quickly it can gain altitude.
Right.
That's where we get into different climb profiles, like maximum angle of climb and maximum rate of climb.
So maximum angle of climb, or AOC, is the steepest possible climb, right?
Exactly.
That's important for clearing obstacles after takeoff or maybe flying over mountainous terrain.
You got it. And then there's maximum rate of climb, or ROC,
Okay.
which is all about gaining altitude as quickly as possible.
Right.
That's important for reaching cruising altitude efficiently.
It seems like there's a lot to consider when it comes to climbing.
Yeah.
Do factors like weight and altitude affect climb performance?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The heavier the aircraft, the less excess power it has available for climbing.
Yeah.
And as we talked about earlier, higher density altitude reduces engine power and lift,
Right.
making it harder to climb.
Right.
So a heavily loaded plane taking off on a hot day will definitely struggle to gain altitude.
This is all starting to make sense.
Yeah.
So we've covered the atmosphere, the four forces of flight, and how aircraft climb.
Yeah.
But what about going the distance? How far can an airplane actually fly on a given amount of fuel?
Right.
That's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Absolutely.
All right, so we've covered how an airplane battles those four forces of flight.
Right.
But what about going the distance? How far can a plane actually fly on a given tank of fuel?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
It's not just about how much fuel you have, it's about how efficiently you use it.
Right.
That's where we get into range and endurance.
Okay, so range is basically how far an aircraft can fly on a given amount of fuel.
Yeah.
Like how many miles you can get out of a full tank in your car.
Precisely. And then there's endurance,
Okay.
which refers to how long the aircraft can stay airborne on that same amount of fuel. It's like comparing a marathon runner who goes the distance with a sprinter who focuses on speed.
So you might maximize range if you're flying a long-haul commercial flight across the ocean.
Right.
But you'd focus on endurance if you were conducting a search and rescue mission,
Yeah.
wanting to stay in the air as long as possible.
Exactly. And the pilot training manual you shared dives into how to achieve either of these goals.
Okay.
It highlights something called specific range,
Okay.
which is a way to measure how many nautical miles you can squeeze out of each unit of fuel.
So specific range is like figuring out your car's miles per gallon,
Exactly.
but for an airplane, makes sense.
And then there's specific endurance,
Okay.
which tells you how long you can stay airborne for each unit of fuel.
Right.
Think of it as your flight hours per gallon.
This is fascinating.
Mhm.
So if you want to fly far, you need to maximize specific range. And if you want to stay up in the air for a long time,
Right.
you need to maximize specific endurance.
You got it.
But how do pilots actually do that?
Right.
What's the secret sauce?
Well, the key to maximizing range lies in flying at what's called LDMX.
LDMX?
Yeah.
That sounds pretty technical.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
Think of it this way. An airplane is constantly fighting drag,
Right.
that force that tries to slow it down,
Right.
and lift is what keeps it airborne.
Right.
So the lift-to-drag ratio is a measure of how much lift the aircraft generates for a given amount of drag.
Okay, so a higher lift-to-drag ratio means the plane is more efficient, right?
Exactly.
It's getting more lift for less drag.
And LD max is that sweet spot where the aircraft is achieving the most lift for the least amount of drag.
Okay.
It's like finding the perfect balance between those two opposing forces.
So if you want to fly far, you need to find that LD max and hang out there as long as possible.
Exactly.
But doesn't flying at LDMX usually mean flying slower? Wouldn't that make the flight take longer?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And yes, flying at LD max often means sacrificing some speed. But remember, we're talking about maximizing range, not necessarily speed.
Right.
It's about covering the most distance on the least amount of fuel.
Right.
Sometimes slowing down a bit can actually get you further.
So it's a trade-off between speed and fuel efficiency. That makes sense.
And as always, things like weight and altitude play a role here.
Sure.
A heavier aircraft will need more lift to stay airborne,
Right.
which means it will have to fly at a slightly higher speed to maintain LD max.
Okay.
And higher density altitudes with that thinner air we talked about earlier
Yeah.
can also affect the airspeed required to achieve LD max.
Wow. It's amazing how everything is interconnected.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears and talk about those critical phases of flight, takeoff, and landing.
Right.
I mean, those are the moments when things can get a little intense,
Absolutely.
even for experienced pilots.
The manual you shared emphasizes how crucial it is for pilots to understand the factors at play during takeoff and landing,
Right.
as those are statistically when most pilot-caused accidents occur.
It's like a reminder that even seasoned pilots need to be on their A game during these critical phases.
Exactly.
Every takeoff and landing is a test of skill and judgment.
And the manual goes into great detail about how factors like runway surface,
Okay.
the gradient or slope of the runway, and even the presence of water can significantly impact both takeoff and landing performance.
For example, if the runway is wet, it reduces friction.
Right.
Which means it takes longer for the plane to accelerate during takeoff and decelerate during landing.
Exactly.
And I remember reading about the terrifying phenomenon of dynamic hydroplaning.
Ah, yes, dynamic hydroplaning, a pilot's nightmare.
Yeah.
That occurs when a layer of water builds up between the aircraft's tires and the runway surface,
Okay.
essentially causing the tires to lose contact with the ground.
Oh.
The aircraft can then skid uncontrollably.
So if you're landing on a wet runway and you hit a patch of standing water, you could essentially lose control of the plane.
It certainly can be.
That's pretty scary.
The manual even provides a formula for calculating the minimum speed for dynamic hydroplaning based on your tire pressure,
Okay.
but it's just one of many factors pilots need to consider during takeoff and landing.
So what other factors affect takeoff performance?
Right.
I mean, aside from the obvious things like the weight of the plane and the power of the engines.
Well, you've got those basic elements, of course.
Right.
But the manual also breaks down how things like wind conditions,
Okay.
density altitude, remember our friend density altitude,
Yeah.
runway slope, and even the surface condition of the runway all play a role in determining how much runway you'll need to get airborne safely.
So a headwind would help you take off in a shorter distance.
Exactly.
Because it gives you a little extra lift, right?
And a tailwind would make you need more runway.
Right. And taking off from a sloped runway
Yeah.
can either help or hinder your takeoff performance, depending on whether you're going uphill or downhill.
Exactly.
And a smooth, dry runway provides more friction, helping you accelerate faster.
Right.
While a rough or wet runway can increase your takeoff distance.
It's like a giant physics equation with all these variables interacting to determine how the plane will behave.
And the same goes for landing.
Absolutely.
The heavier the plane, the faster it will be coming in for landing.
Right.
And the more runway you'll need to come to a safe stop.
A headwind will help you slow down and reduce your landing distance,
Right.
while a tailwind will make you need more runway.
That makes sense. And I remember the manual sharing a pretty gripping story about a pilot
Yeah.
who attempted to land on a wet runway with a tailwind.
Right.
He ended up overshooting the runway because he didn't account for how those factors would affect his landing distance.
That story really highlights how quickly things can go wrong if a pilot doesn't fully grasp the factors at play during these critical phases of flight. It's a stark reminder of the importance of careful planning, precise calculations, and sound judgment.
So we've covered atmospheric conditions, the forces of flight climbing range,
Right.
and even the nail-biting phases of takeoff and landing.
Yeah.
But what about all those speeds that pilots have to keep track of?
Right.
I've seen those cockpit instruments in movies, and they look pretty complicated.
That's where we dive into the world of V-speeds.
Okay.
A whole alphabet soup of critical airspeeds that pilots need to have at their fingertips.
Okay.
Each one tells a story about the aircraft's performance and limitations.
Okay, so we've piqued my curiosity. What are some of the key V speeds that pilots need to know?
Well, we've got true airspeed, or TAS,
Okay.
which is the actual speed of the aircraft relative to the air mass it's flying through. And then there's indicated airspeed, or IAS,
Okay.
which is what the pilot sees on the airspeed indicator in the cockpit.
Right. Right.
It's affected by things like air density and instrument error.
So IAS is like the speedometer in your car, but TAS is the actual speed you're traveling through the air.
Exactly.
But why do pilots need to know both?
Because both speeds are important for different reasons.
Okay.
IAS is used for things like controlling the aircraft and avoiding stalls,
Right.
while TAS is crucial for navigation and calculating things like fuel consumption and time of arrival.
Okay, so those are just two V speeds.
Right.
What are some others that pilots need to know?
Well, there's calibrated airspeed, or CAS,
Okay.
which is IAS corrected for instrument and position errors.
Got it.
And then there's equivalent airspeed, or EAS,
Okay.
which takes into account compressibility effects at higher speeds.
Wow.
It's a lot to keep straight.
It's like having 4 different speedometers, each telling a slightly different story.
Huh.
But I'm guessing there are even more V speeds to keep track of.
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
There are speeds related to stalling, like VS0,
Okay.
the stall speed and landing configuration,
Right.
and VS1, the stall speed in a clean configuration with flaps and gear, retracted. And then there are speeds for optimal climb performance, like VY,
Right.
the speed for the best rate of climb,
Got it.
and VX, the speed for the best angle of climb.
This is starting to sound like a foreign language.
Right.
I'm beginning to understand why pilots need years of training to master all this.
Yeah,
But surely there's a way to simplify all this information, right?
you're in luck.
Okay.
That's where those handy-dandy performance charts come in.
Performance charts.
Good.
That sounds promising. Tell me more.
Well, as the pilot training manual you've shared explains,
Okay.
these charts are found in the Aircraft Flight Manual, or AFM,
Okay.
and the Pilot's Operating Handbook, or POH.
Right.
They cover everything from takeoff and climb performance to cruise and landing data and even stall speed characteristics.
So instead of having to memorize all these complex formulas and calculations, pilots can refer to these charts to get a quick snapshot of how their aircraft will behave under different conditions.
Exactly.
That sounds way less stressful.
And these charts take into account all those factors we've been discussing, like weight, altitude, temperature, wind conditions, and even runway characteristics.
Wow.
They're a pilot's best friend when it comes to planning and executing a safe and efficient flight.
But aren't these charts based on standard conditions? What happens when those real-world conditions we talked about earlier come into play?
Right.
How do pilots account for things like high-density altitude or a strong tailwind?
That's a great question. You're right. Those charts are based on standard atmospheric conditions.
Yeah.
But the beauty of these charts is that they provide instructions and correction factors for adjusting the data based on the actual conditions you're facing.
So it's like a puzzle putting all the pieces together to get an accurate picture of how your aircraft will perform on any given day.
Exactly.
That sounds pretty challenging.
It can be, but that's part of what makes flying so fascinating and rewarding.
Right.
It's a constant dance between science, skill, and judgment, adapting to ever-changing conditions to achieve your mission safely and efficiently.
Okay, so we've got these performance charts that are like personalized cheat sheets for pilots. But can you give me a specific example of how these charts are actually used?
Sure.
Say you're a pilot getting ready to take off on a hot day.
Okay.
How would you use a performance chart to make sure you have enough runway
Let's dive into that in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll explore how pilots use those performance charts to decode their aircraft's capabilities and make informed decisions in the air.
All right, so we've got these performance charts like personalized cheat sheets for pilots, but can you give me a specific example of how these charts are actually used? Say you're a pilot getting ready to take off on a hot day. How would you use a performance chart to make sure you have enough runway?
That's where the magic of performance charts really comes to life. Let's walk through that scenario.
Yeah.
You're the pilot. It's a scorcher out there, and you're getting ready to take off. First, you'd consult the density altitude chart.
So this density altitude chart helps you figure out how the hot temperature is affecting the air density, which in turn impacts your plane's performance. It's like a reality check for how your plane will actually behave, right?
Exactly. You'd input the airport elevation, the outside air temperature, and your altimeter setting to calculate the density altitude for your departure airport. Let's say the chart tells you the density altitude is significantly higher than the actual airport elevation. That means the air is thinner and you'll need a longer takeoff roll.
Okay, so now you know the density altitude. What's next?
Next, you'd grab your handy-dandy takeoff chart. These charts are amazing because they give you a visual representation of how various factors affect your takeoff distance. You'll see lines for different flat configurations, obstacle heights, and even wind conditions.
So you'd find the line on the chart that corresponds to your calculated density altitude and then factor in things like your takeoff weight, any obstacles you need to clear, and the wind conditions.
Exactly. Let's say you have a light tailwind. You'd find the appropriate correction factor for that tailwind on the chart and adjust your takeoff distance accordingly. The chart might show you that you need a few hundred feet more runway than you would under standard conditions.
So it's like a puzzle. You're taking all these factors into account, adjusting and refining your calculations based on what the chart tells you. It's all about getting a clear and accurate picture of what your plane needs to safely get off the ground.
You got it. And once you're airborne, you'll need to consult your climb chart. These charts can tell you how much time and fuel it'll take to reach your desired cruising altitude, factoring in things like your weight and the density altitude. You'll even find data on optimal climb speeds to maximize your efficiency.
So these charts are essentially guiding the pilot through the entire flight from takeoff to landing. It's like having a personalized flight plan generator right there in the cockpit.
And for those longer flights, the manual dives into cruise charts as well. These charts provide insights into fuel consumption, time, and distance to climb to different altitudes. You can even find the optimal cruise settings to maximize your range, taking into account the winds aloft and your aircraft's weight.
So the pilot is constantly referencing these charts, adjusting their strategy based on what the charts tell them. It's like a continuous feedback loop between the pilot, the aircraft, and the environment.
Absolutely. And don't forget about those crosswind charts. If you're landing in a strong crosswind, you'll need to use the chart to calculate the headwind and crosswind components for any given wind direction and velocity.
So you can choose the most favorable runway and make any necessary adjustments to your approach and landing technique to ensure the aircraft stays within its safe operating limits.
And speaking of landing, we have landing charts for that too. These charts help pilots determine how much runway they'll need to safely bring the plane to a stop, considering factors like density, altitude, landing weight, which is usually less than takeoff weight because you've burned some fuel wind conditions, and even obstacle height.
It's amazing how much planning and precision goes into every phase of flight. It's not just about pointing the plane in the right direction and hoping for the best.
You're absolutely right. And for those pilots who really want to understand the limits of their aircraft, there are stall speed charts as well. These charts tell you at what speed the aircraft will stall, taking into account factors like the angle of bank, the position of the landing gear and flaps, and even the throttle position.
So much data, so much to consider. It's a testament to the skill and training of pilots that they can juggle all these factors, reference those performance charts, and make split-second decisions in the air.
That's what separates pilots from passengers. They don't just fly the plane, they understand the science behind it.
So what does all this mean for you? Now that you have a glimpse into the world of aircraft performance, you can appreciate the complexity behind those seemingly effortless flights you witness every day. From atmospheric conditions to the forces of flight to those insightful performance charts, there's a whole symphony of factors working together to keep those planes soaring through the sky.
And remember, every flight is a unique performance, a carefully orchestrated dance between the pilot, the aircraft, and the environment.
So the next time you see an airplane gracefully taking off or landing, take a moment to appreciate the science, the skill, and the precision that make it all possible. Who knows, maybe you'll even be inspired to delve deeper into the fascinating world of aviation yourself.